I bought my first home in early 2020 and I went with Gatehouse Bank. A few years earlier, my dad went with Al Rayyan Bank when he bought his house. So between the two experiences, I've actually fully experienced what the Islamic mortgage market is like for Muslims in the UK. Would I say that the experience was the most miraculous experience that I ever had? Probably not. But would I say it was the most unbearable experience like some people claim it is? No, definitely not. I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. In this video, I want to share with you some of the steps I went through and the research I did before I ultimately decided to go for an Islamic mortgage. The very first thing I did was to work out whether or not I thought Islamic mortgages were legit or not. The other key thing I did was consider the alternatives. Now, in my day, there weren't that many alternatives, so what I'll do is I'll cover some of the new alternatives that have come onto the market as well. There's a lot of noise around Islamic mortgages, but if you really want to drill down into what is going on, you need to read the contracts, because at heart, this is a legal relationship between you and the bank. Really simply, an Islamic mortgage is a partnership between you and the bank rather than a loan from the bank to you. The concept is pretty straightforward. You buy a percentage of the house with your deposit and the bank buys the rest. And then you rent the bank's portion from them, and then over time you slowly buy back from the bank the entire property until eventually you own the entire thing. Of course, there's a lot more complexity than just that. We've actually done a deep dive of Al Rayyan Bank and Gatehouse Bank's Islamic mortgages, and we've got a review on the Islamic Finance Guru website that you can check out. So if you want to go real deep into all of this stuff, then that's the place to get started. So far so good, but the two key objections that Islamic mortgages face are, firstly, they're just mimicking conventional mortgages, aren't they? And secondly, they're more expensive. So are they mimicking the mainstream? Well, the answer requires a little bit of a history lesson, because you see, the way Islamic mortgages are today actually got developed about 20 years ago, where the campaigners at the time worked very closely with lawyers and politicians and policymakers and regulators to make changes to the system, particularly the law, to enable Islamic mortgages to be delivered. They also had to get special exemptions from HMRC so that double stamp duty wasn't charged on an Islamic mortgage. They also had to develop a product that fundamentally attracted enough capital for them to then be able to give out in Islamic mortgages as well. This was a long and arduous journey, and eventually the Islamic mortgage that we see today was the result of complicated and long, difficult negotiations between policymakers, politicians, lawyers, the bankers behind this, Islamic scholars, and the commercial interests, as well as the community members themselves. It is true that the risk profile of Islamic banks and conventional banks is similar. However, there are important and material differences between the two. For example, Islamic banks can't borrow off other banks to get their money. They need to go to savings accounts to get that money. And savings accounts need to be paid somewhere between 1% and 2% annually, whereas with a conventional bank, you might get the money for maybe 0.5%. There is a material difference, therefore, in how much it costs the Islamic banks to get the money, and that therefore reflects in the price. The second key difference is that an Islamic bank would ultimately be on the hook if your house got destroyed and the insurance company didn't pay out on it for whatever reason. Whereas in the conventional setup, you would still owe the conventional bank that debt. Am I saying that Islamic banks are doing all that they need to do and that they are perfect from an ownership and risk-taking perspective from an Islamic lens? No, that's not what I'm saying. I think they can and should be doing more, and we should be evolving our structures from the 20 years ago structures that we developed to what we can do now. But are they Sharia compliant? Yes, my view is yes. When I went to buy a house, there weren't really that many credible alternatives to getting an Islamic mortgage, which is what I ultimately did. But now there really are. Let's dive into some of them. First off, you have Wayhome, which is an alternative to an Islamic mortgage that lets you buy your home gradually over time. You can buy up to 40% of the house, though it is a little bit more expensive than your typical Islamic mortgage. On the plus side, you can get started with a pretty low deposit. They also don't let you buy any old property. You have to buy the properties that have been pre-vetted by them on their platform. This has a plus side and a downside. The downside is, of course, the number of properties you can go for is a little bit more restricted. The upside is, interestingly, they will actually negotiate the price with the seller. So if you're someone who's a little bit faint-hearted when it comes to negotiation, this is actually a nice perk where you get the professionals to do this for you. I'd add in here that Wayhome is sponsoring this show, but as ever, we are featuring other providers to give you a proper sense of the entire market. Another very intriguing option is primary finance. Here you buy again in a shared ownership model. It is a little bit more expensive than Islamic mortgage still. With them, you can actually buy the entire house and it is unambiguously Sharia compliant. There is, however, a pretty long waiting list to actually get yourself a house, so that could be something to factor in if you want to buy it relatively quickly. Finally, there's a company called Crowd to Live. I'm really excited about these guys because they're a young startup and they're bringing a novel concept to this market. So they're taking property crowdfunding and bringing it to the Islamic financing market. So what you do is you turn up and you say, I want to buy this house, and Crowd to Live then puts it on their platform and investors put up the money to actually buy that house for you, and in return, they will get a fixed rent over the next few years. They are a young startup, so they are still building up that capacity on their platform, but really exciting to watch as they grow over the next few years. Would I still go for an Islamic mortgage today? Probably. I happen to have a 20% deposit, so for me, it would have been cheaper, and it still is cheaper, to go for an Islamic mortgage. But if I had less than that deposit, then I would probably go for an alternative, because that way I can get onto the housing ladder faster, and I know that would save me tens of thousands of pounds in the long run.